Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kiangundo Pea Berry Wash Process Kenya from Mock Coffee Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And Mock, based out of Brussels, Belgium. And they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel twice before. And in both of those reviews, the coffees did perform a little bit above expectation. So at some point, I wanted to go back and review one of their African coffees, given that neither of those two reviews were of African coffees. And that's where this one comes into play, as not only is it a Kenyan coffee, but it also offers a vine tomato note listed on the bag. And another thing I've always wanted to do is review a Kenyan coffee that actually lists tomato on the bag itself. So this review is essentially killing two birds with one stone in that regard, and I'm definitely looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 31. And recipe we settled on for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one has been in line with our previous experiences with this coffee roaster, as I would say that it's not quite as light as a lot of other coffee roasters, as it's still on the more light side of things. And I think kind of the best guide I have for this one is it felt maybe slightly more developed than a couple of the other ones we've reviewed from them. So it's still pushing maybe the slightly more developed side of a lighter profiled coffee, if not then a very light side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 12, first impression, and ran it through the V60 and definitely noticed plenty of brightness right at the start, but in addition to that, there was a fair bit of sweetness to balance all of that out. It was slightly savory, was definitely expecting that going into it, with a smoky aspect as well, all kind of complemented by a wonderful candied berry and almost pastry-like sweetness on the back end. It did open up a little bit as it cooled, so it was an okay start. It was an interesting start. We continue on to day 14 as I ran into the Chemex for the first time, and the cup at this point seemed to be unapologetically tomato-like in terms of the direction it was headed, as it actually wasn't bad given that there was enough sweetness to balance out that much more savory side of the coffee. It does skew heavy on the brightness as well as the citrus, so it was fun in that regard, as it just kind of said, hey, this is what this coffee is and we're not going to apologize about it, and that's something I appreciated about this one. Day 16, ran it through the April dripper, and this is the most Kenyan forward this coffee had been up to this point, as it was the most savory, very strong in that tomato-like direction with a bright tart berry and an abundance of citrus as well. So they have lime listed on here, and I definitely agree with that because the lime was an ever-present component throughout, complementing what was an initially savory cup right at the start, but that's not something that's going to be persistent throughout, because there was a candied-like aspect we had mentioned in the earlier days that was a little less pronounced through the April. Not quite as good on this day, but the coffee's going to change a little bit, as here on day 18, if there's such thing as a candied tomato-like experience, that's what I was experiencing on this day, as it was pretty savory, but equally as sweet in a slightly more candied sense. So maybe a sweeter tomato, maybe that's what they're going for in terms of that vine tomato description, but it continues to retain all of its candied sweetness, so I was actually quite enjoying this day 18 mark. I didn't mind the kind of counterbalancing aspects within this one. In addition to that, there was a defined lime-like aspect, and that's one thing I have to give them credit for, is it was a very strongly defined lime aspect in this one. It wasn't necessarily just a generic citrus component, but much more of a very specific heightened lime aspect. In addition to that, there is a slight herbality, so I was actually having fun with this coffee. Day 20, ran it through the Chemex, and it's at this moment I definitely settled on the V60 as my preferred brew method for this one, as it wasn't quite as good in the Chemex. Still candied sweet, but it continues to skew a little bit more on the savory side of things. I was noticing significantly less of the savory aspects through the V60 than with the Chemex or the April dripper. In addition to that, there are a still fair bit of the bright citric aspects to it, slightly less defined in general through the Chemex, which is interesting to me, but overall, still a nice day. Day 23, the cup has been pretty consistent when I am focusing on the direction I've chosen for this one, as it still has a fair bit of savoriness. I don't think that's going to go away. I think given that that's what this coffee is supposed to be, and something that I've just kind of learned to live with, but given just how much of a sweetness there is in this coffee, I don't mind having that contrasting savory aspect to it. In addition to that, I've noticed a little bit more of the herbality to this one, so that's definitely leaning in the direction of that hibiscus-like aspect that I like to identify in a lot of Kenyan coffees in general. Overall, it's just pretty well defined. At the end of the day, that's one of the really important things about this coffee is it's not really leaving anything up to chance. It's just very specific in the flavor profile that's within this coffee. Day 25 found a really nice spot as it has reached, again, a level of consistency in a good way, as it's steadily increasing in the overall improvement to the cup, with the berry brightness being one of the more pronounced components within this one. It's something I haven't mentioned a whole lot throughout this review up to this point, as it's there, it's noticeable, but I was really honing in on the dominant citrus as well as savory aspects of this one, as well as the candied aspect, because those things were really just kind of shining through the most. But it was on this day I was really noticing the most shift, as the sweetness was really outweighing the savory aspect in this one. Plenty of sweetness in the finish, so again, a pretty fun coffee. Day 28, possibly a slight drop off as it wasn't quite as vibrant, and I kept everything the same, so maybe possibly a brewing error, but it's just a little bit more savory all around. And that's typically something I specifically have noticed from Kenyan coffees, is they don't seem to have the same sort of shelf life for me as I think that they do, as other origins do. But nonetheless, still a fair bit of that floral herbality reminiscent of hibiscus yet again. Heightened citrus characteristics with a slightly less defined candied berry sweetness to the cup. Even then, still a little bit more in terms of the sweetness and in terms of the savoriness. So I'm still enjoying this coffee up to this day. Not too much has changed on day 31. It's been a little bit more in line with day 28 than it had been with day 25. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 5 level 4s. So let's go through those real quick, and we will start with the finish at a level 4. I don't think that there's anything to really say on that one, because as I always say, if a Kenyan coffee doesn't reach a level 4 in terms of the finish, then I'm not entirely sure what happened with that coffee. But definitely a fair bit of the lasting, interestingly, brightness to this one, but also kind of candied aspect to it, so sweetness as well. So really liking that part of this coffee. Sweetness level 4, and I'm going to mention the cleanliness alongside of that, because I had to decide which one of these I wanted to put at a level 4. I said if the clarity, the cleanliness is at a level 4, then the sweetness I'll probably have to bump down to a level 3 and vice versa. And I felt that the sweetness was maybe a little bit better than the kind of definition to this coffee. So this is always good for Kenyan coffees. If they reach that level 4 mark in terms of the sweetness, then I am actually pretty happy with that. And I've thrown out some interesting descriptors, including like candied tomato, but also that candied berry sweetness, because this coffee did have a candied aspect to it in general. So I'm happy with it being there at that level 4. And while we're discussing the cleanliness, even though I wanted to save that maybe for last, the reason it reached that level 3 mark was because it still had a fair bit of that savoriness to it. As you can see, that savoriness is there on the level 3. And while I would still push this on the higher side of level 3, and I even tossed around the idea of maybe the lower side of level 4, it isn't quite as, I don't know, void of that savory aspect as a lot of other Kenyan coffees. And I've always said the reason I don't score too many Kenyan coffees at that level 4 is because of the savory aspect in those coffees. So it's definitely on the higher side of level 3, definitely on the lower side of level 4, but one of the cleaner Kenyan coffees, especially one that has a very strong savory aspect to it. Let's continue through the rest. And the berry fruit level 4, I will say that that one was actually on the lower side of level 4. While there is a fair bit of that candied berry brightness to this cup, it isn't necessarily as pronounced as the citrus, which is the much more defined and strong fruit profile within this one. So that right there definitely justifies that level 4. But the berry fruit was present and prominent enough and defined enough to justify that level 4 as well. So that definitely finished there on that mark. I skipped over the acidity, but I don't think that there's too much to say on that. It's a pretty bright coffee. It's a Kenyan coffee. Once again, it's very rare. Kenyan coffees don't score that level 4 in terms of the acidity as well. Then we have a handful of level 3s. I already mentioned the cleanliness, the florality, level 3. I think that's something that I noticed maybe a little bit more specifically about this coffee. They don't have any note listed on here that specifically would have indicated that's the direction this coffee was going. But the more I drank it, the more of that kind of savory herbality I was experiencing within this one. And given that the coffee was already skewing in the red direction, it made it for a very easy kind of note for me on this one, that hibiscus-like aspect to it. Spice, level 3, yes, there was a kind of spice quality to it. I didn't necessarily have a great descriptor I wanted to go with in that direction, but given that this coffee was just a little bit more herbal, a little bit of this kind of spice to go with that as well, definitely think it reached that level 3 mark. Savoriness, Level 3, I briefly mentioned that, but yes, they have a tomato note listed on here. I don't know what you would have expected for the savoriness. I actually did a pretty good job of toning that down because I feel like the maybe April Brewer might have put that all the way up at the higher side of level 4. The Chemex at times was also definitely there at that level 4 mark, but given that this one may be on the lower side of level 3, it's a little bit of a win for me because obviously I don't like the tomato in Kenyan coffees. That's my biggest detracting point of Kenyan coffees. But I got to give them credit for putting that note on there and then it kind of coming through overpowered by the sweetness in the cup. Body level 3, once again, Kenyan coffee, run through the V60. It's definitely going to have that juicy body, fair bit of that texture to it, so that's no surprise there. And I think that's the last thing really worth discussing in that tasting wheel because I think it's a pretty nice representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Once again, the same thing has happened with mock as the coffee had a little bit better of a result than I had expected going into it. And here's one thing I wanted to say about mock, and maybe one of the more important things I wanted to say about them is none of the coffees I've picked up from them have necessarily been my type of coffee to begin with, but it has been interesting that every time I do look at what they're offering, I don't find a coffee that I would say, this is my type of coffee. So I think that maybe they just kind of purchase coffees that aren't necessarily my type of coffee to begin with, as there are coffee roasters like that. Tim Wendelboe is another one that typically picks up coffees that aren't my profile coffee to begin with. They kind of just have a preference for coffees that aren't the same style as my preferences in general. So the fact that, just like with Tim Wendelboe, they're able to perform a little bit better than I expect going into them, that's a credit to the coffee roaster. So I think that they're doing a very nice job. And I'm sure at some point they will release something that is a little bit more my flavor profile. And at that point, I'm going to try that coffee. But the other thing I wanted to say about them is I want to give them huge credit for putting that tomato note on there, as this one may not have necessarily been the most tomato forward Kenyan coffee I've ever experienced, but there are so many coffee roasters that I feel like maybe shy away from putting that note on there, full well knowing that their coffees do taste like tomatoes, mostly because they don't want to deter customers from actually trying them. In this case, it actually prompted me to want to try this coffee a lot more. So I think that it's really nice just kind of presenting that honesty within your coffee to the consumer. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think this one does skew a little bit more in the direction of the traditional Kenyan coffee consumer, the one that does like the savory aspects to it, because this had plenty of that. It had a lot of those Kenyan characteristics. In addition to that, the brightness was present yet again, the berry aspect was present, and the citrus aspect was present. So it had all of those things, but what sold me on this one was a very well-defined profile to it, as well as a sweeter cup in general, as those were the things I mentioned early on, and those were the things I highlighted the most during that tasting wheel, because I think that's what really set this Kenyan coffee apart from one that on paper I shouldn't have liked as much as I did, but the end result was me liking this coffee a lot more than I probably should have. I think I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kiangundo Peaberry Wash Process Kenya from Mock Coffee Roastery. Thank you for watching.